There is a strange illusion we grow up with. The belief that humanity naturally moves toward wisdom, that progress means intelligence, that time filters out foolishness. Charles Bukowski did not believe this for a second. He looked at the modern world and saw something far more disturbing. Not a decline into chaos, but a smooth, comfortable settling into mediocrity. A society where shallow thinking is not only tolerated, but celebrated. Where noise replaces insight. Where confidence replaces understanding. Bukowski once wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." But he went further than Thoreau ever dared. He suggested that many are not desperate at all. They are satisfied. Satisfied with borrowed opinions. Satisfied with simple answers. Satisfied with never asking why. This is not a story about intelligence versus stupidity. It is a story about comfort versus awareness. Because thinking deeply hurts. It destabilizes identity. It breaks illusions. And most people do not want to be broken. So they defend what feels safe. They defend what feels familiar, even when it is empty. This is how a world becomes what Bukowski hinted at. Not a tragic place, but a ridiculous one. A place where those who refuse to think loudly protect their refusal, and where the ones who hesitate, doubt, or observe too carefully are pushed to the margins. As Bertrand Russell warned, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves. Bukowski saw this certainty everywhere, in crowds, in systems, in everyday conversations that never go anywhere but somehow never stop. This video is not an insult. It is an examination of how society rewards shallow certainty, of why thoughtlessness organizes itself so effectively, and of what it costs to remain awake in a world that prefers to sleep. This is where we begin. There is a particular kind of sentence that feels like a punch rather than a thought. Charles Bukowski was very good at those sentences, not because they were clever, but because they were uncomfortable. When Bukowski suggested that society is filled with people who passionately defend stupidity, he was not simply insulting the world. He was pointing at something far more unsettling. The idea that stupidity is not an accident of society, but one of its most stable foundations. He once wrote, "The problem with the world is that the intelligent people are full of doubts, while the stupid ones are full of confidence." This is not bitterness. It is observation. Look closely, and you begin to see what he meant. The loudest voices are rarely the most thoughtful ones. Certainty speaks faster than reflection. Confidence travels further than doubt. And in a world designed for speed, simplicity always defeats depth. Bukowski understood that modern society does not merely tolerate shallow thinking, it rewards it. The person who asks too many questions is called negative. The one who hesitates is labeled weak. The one who doubts is told to move on. Meanwhile, the one who repeats the obvious with conviction is applauded for being real. This is how the paradise forms. Not through intelligence, but through agreement. Not through truth, but through repetition. The frightening part is not that stupidity exists, it always has. The frightening part is that it organizes itself. It finds community. It builds moral certainty around itself and becomes hostile to anything that threatens its comfort. George Orwell hinted at this when he wrote, "Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think." Bukowski would have agreed, though he would have said it with more blood on the page. When thinking becomes optional and conformity becomes survival, the world slowly rearranges itself around the lowest effort version of truth. And once that happens, intelligence doesn't disappear. It becomes suspicious. Depth becomes arrogance. Silence becomes weakness. And reflection becomes a threat. This is the soil in which Bukowski's anger grew. Not hatred for people, but frustration with a system that teaches them never to look inward. A system that teaches them that feeling deeply is unnecessary, that thinking slowly is inefficient, and that doubt is a flaw rather than a sign of awareness. In such a world, stupidity does not need to be enforced. It is willingly defended. This is not yet an attack. It is a diagnosis, and it is only the beginning. Stupidity, in Bukowski's sense, is not passive. It does not sit quietly in the corner. It moves. It organizes. It attacks. This is the part most people miss. Bukowski understood that shallow thinking survives not because it is strong, but because it is comfortable. And comfort, once established, becomes aggressive. Anything that threatens it feels like violence. A thinking person introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty introduces anxiety. And anxiety demands a response. So the response is rejection. Bukowski once wrote, "An intellectual says a simple thing in a hard way. An artist says a hard thing in a simple way." What society often hears, however, is not simplicity or depth, but danger. Because a hard truth, even when spoken simply, destabilizes the fragile architecture of borrowed beliefs. This is where stupidity turns defensive. Psychologically, this is not mysterious. The ego is built on coherence. When someone questions the ideas we use to define ourselves, it feels like an attack on our identity. Carl Jung warned about this when he said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Bukowski would have underlined that sentence and laughed bitterly. To think deeply is to risk discovering that much of what we believe is inherited, not chosen. That our opinions may be echoes rather than insights. That our certainty may be nothing more than fear wearing armor. And fear hates mirrors. So stupidity does what it does best. It simplifies. It labels. It mocks. It shouts. It replaces nuance with slogans and reflection with reaction. In so doing, it creates community, not around truth, but around agreement. Hannah Arendt touched this nerve when she spoke of the banality of evil. Not monstrous intelligence, but ordinary thoughtlessness. Bukowski saw the same phenomenon in everyday life, stripped of politics and dressed in habits, routines, and small talk that never dares to look inward. In such an environment, intelligence becomes isolating. Depth feels lonely. Silence feels suspicious. And the person who pauses before speaking is often drowned out by the one who never pauses at all. This is why Bukowski did not romanticize society. He romanticized outsiders, the drunk, the poet, the loser, the observer. Not because they were better people, but because they were less invested in defending illusions. They had already failed at belonging. And failure, paradoxically, gave them clarity. Stupidity defends itself because it must. Without defense, it collapses. Without noise, it is exposed. Without numbers, it is fragile. And this is why the world often feels upside down, not because intelligence vanished, but because it learned to whisper in a place that only rewards shouting. And yet, the question remains, what happens to the person who refuses to shout back? That is where Bukowski's thought becomes personal and uncomfortable. That is where the real confrontation begins. Bukowski never believed that intelligence belonged to the crowd. He believed it survived on the margins, not because outsiders are morally superior, but because they are unprotected. They do not have the shelter of belonging. They are not buffered by consensus. And because of this, they are forced to see the world without anesthesia. Bukowski once wrote, "I was waiting for something extraordinary to happen, but as the years wasted on nothing ever did unless I caused it." That sentence contains his entire philosophy. The world does not awaken you. Society does not reward awareness. If anything, it dulls it. Awakening happens only when you fall out of line. The outsider sees what the insider cannot afford to see. This is where Bukowski quietly aligns with Nietzsche again. Nietzsche believed that the herd fears the individual not because he is violent, but because he is independent. The outsider threatens the unspoken agreement that holds the herd together. Do not look too closely. Do not question too deeply. Do not disturb the shared illusion. Bukowski's drunks, gamblers, and failures exist outside that agreement. They have already been excluded. And exclusion removes the need to pretend. This is why the outsider often sounds cruel, why honesty feels harsh, why clarity feels offensive. Truth spoken without social padding feels like an attack to those who depend on comfort. And Bukowski refused padding. He wrote the way life hits, blunt, uneven, and uninterested in politeness. Arthur Schopenhauer once noted, "Truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident." Bukowski lived permanently between the first 2 stages. Ridicule and rejection were not side effects. They were proof that he was touching something real. But there is a cost to this position. The outsider is not free in the romantic sense. He is exposed. He is misunderstood. He is often alone. Bukowski never pretended otherwise. He did not sell transcendence. He sold endurance. The ability to sit with discomfort without lying to yourself. The ability to see society clearly without expecting it to thank you. In a world that rewards stupidity for being agreeable, the outsider gains one advantage: clarity without obligation. He does not need to defend the system that rejects him. He does not need to explain himself to the crowd. And that freedom, though painful, is dangerous. Because once you see how aggressively stupidity protects itself, you also see how fragile it really is. How much effort it takes to maintain shallow certainty. How loud it must be to drown out doubt. The outsider learns something the crowd never does. The noise is not strength. It is fear. And once that realization settles in, there is no going back to comfort. Only forward, into awareness. And this leads us to the final confrontation, not with society, but with ourselves. At some point, Bukowski's critique stops pointing outward. It turns around. And when it does, it becomes dangerous. Because the real question is not whether society is full of people who defend stupidity. The real question is why we sometimes feel the urge to defend it too. Why certainty feels good. Why being right feels safer than being honest. Why belonging often matters more than understanding. Bukowski never let himself off the hook. That is why his work cuts deeper than simple social criticism. He knew that stupidity is not something out there. It is a temptation inside every human being. He once wrote, "What matters most is how well you walk through the fire." The fire is not society. The fire is self-examination. And most people avoid it, not because they are incapable, but because it burns illusions they rely on to function. This is where Albert Camus enters the conversation. Camus argued that the human condition is absurd, not because life has no meaning, but because we demand certainty from a world that offers none. The easy solution is denial. The harder one is awareness. Bukowski chose the harder one, even when it destroyed parts of him. To think deeply is to risk humiliation. To question yourself is to risk collapse. To admit ignorance is to risk isolation. And so we cling to ideas the way a drowning person clings to debris. We defend opinions we barely examined. We repeat phrases that sound intelligent. We adopt moral postures that give us identity without requiring effort. This is how stupidity survives, not as a lack of intelligence, but as a refusal of vulnerability. Bukowski saw this clearly, and instead of softening it, he exaggerated it until it became impossible to ignore. His language was offensive because the truth often is. Politeness would have weakened the mirror. The terrifying realization is this: the idiot's paradise does not exist without our participation. It is built daily, through unexamined habits, borrowed outrage, and comfortable certainties we never challenge. And yet, awareness changes everything. The moment you see your own resistance to doubt, you step outside the crowd. Not above it, outside it. And that step, however small, is irreversible. Because once you recognize how deeply comfort shapes belief, you can no longer unsee it. And that leaves only one final question. What do you do with this awareness? That is where Bukowski's thought ends, and where responsibility begins. Bukowski never offered solutions. He offered clarity. He understood that once illusions collapse, nothing neat replaces them. No final wisdom appears. No moral system arrives to organize the chaos. What remains is a choice. Quiet, personal, and often invisible. Do you return to comfort, or do you stay awake? Bukowski stayed awake, even when it cost him stability, reputation, and peace. Not because suffering was noble, but because lying to himself was worse. He once wrote, "You have to die a few times before you can really live." Each death was an illusion shed. Each illusion lost made him less fit for society and more aligned with reality. This is where Bukowski diverges from both optimists and cynics. He did not believe the world would improve through enlightenment, but he also did not believe awareness was pointless. Awareness was not a tool to fix society. It was a way to exist honestly within it. Nietzsche again echoes in the background. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Bukowski's chaos never danced gracefully, but it was real. And reality, even when ugly, is preferable to a polished lie. Choosing awareness does not mean superiority. It does not mean isolation by choice. It means refusing to outsource your thinking. It means slowing down in a world addicted to speed. It means asking questions that lead nowhere obvious. It means resisting the pressure to have an opinion on everything. And yes, it often means being misunderstood. But Bukowski understood something vital. The world does not punish awareness because it is wrong. It punishes it because it is inconvenient. A thinking person cannot be easily predicted. A reflective person cannot be easily controlled. A doubting person cannot be easily absorbed. That is why stupidity feels safe. That is why certainty feels powerful. And that is why both are so aggressively protected. In the end, Bukowski's harshest insight is also his most honest one. Society does not need to become more intelligent to function. It only needs enough people willing to stop thinking. And yet, here you are, listening, reflecting, pausing. That alone places you slightly out of step with the noise. Bukowski would not praise you for it. He would not romanticize it. He would simply say this: stay awake, even if it hurts, because the alternative is far worse. And once you see the paradise for what it is, you can never fully belong to it again. Now comes the part most people quietly avoid. Because this was never really about society. It was never about them. It was always about you. Charles Bukowski did not write for crowds. He wrote against them. And if his words feel uncomfortable, that discomfort is not an accident. It is a signal. A sign that something inside you is being touched, maybe even exposed. Bukowski once said, "People run from rain but sit in bathtubs full of water." They complain about the world while living exactly the way it taught them to live. They criticize stupidity while repeating its patterns. They despise conformity while begging to belong. Ask yourself honestly, how often do you defend an opinion just because it feels like yours? How often do you mistake confidence for truth? How often do you reject an idea, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens who you think you are? This is how the idiot's paradise survives, not through force, through participation. Bukowski understood something brutal. Most people do not want truth. They want validation. They want to be right, not aware. And the moment awareness becomes painful, they retreat, proudly, into certainty. Nietzsche warned, "Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, nations, and ages, it is the rule." Bukowski didn't dress this warning in philosophy. He threw it straight at the reader and waited to see who flinched. If you feel offended, good. If you feel defensive, better. If you feel the urge to dismiss this as exaggeration, even better. Because those reactions are not intellectual, they are emotional, and they reveal attachment. The real insult is not being called an idiot. The real insult is realizing how easily you stop thinking when thinking costs comfort. So here is the line Bukowski never needed to write explicitly. The world is not an idiot's paradise because idiots exist. It is a paradise because too many intelligent people choose silence, ease, and belonging over honesty. You don't escape this world by being smarter. You escape it by being braver. Brave enough to doubt yourself. Brave enough to stand without applause. Brave enough to be misunderstood. Because the moment you stop defending comfort, the paradise collapses. And the moment you stop protecting your own certainties, you step out of it. That is the price, and that is the point. Now the question is simple and unavoidable. Will you stay comfortable, or will you stay awake?